Let's try to start the last session of our beautiful symposium. Hi. I think over the last yesterday and today we had a lot of conversations about the possibilities, how we move from possibilities to applications, how we mainstream some of these things from a scientific and technological point of view. And I think this last session is all about trying to see what are the next steps. Yesterday, Pedro was asking, how do we, where's Pedro? There he is. He was asking, how do we move from the national to the European? How we break those boundaries? What are the mechanisms we need to have in place to start coordinating ourselves in a bit that is in a way that is going above the national level. This session will have a couple of introductory presentations, one by Elena Buzan, one by me, and then we will have a panel discussion with people who are coming, I believe, from the space of European organization of effort in the context of infrastructures, to discuss how potentially infrastructures in the European setting could provide a mechanism for moving forward. We spoke yesterday about the fact of we need to accelerate, we need to move faster, we need to scale up if we want to meet the objectives that we have set for ourselves on a scientific level, but also the objectives that policy has set for us. We've been talking about the inspiration that we are given by the mission statements that both IBOL and EBP are putting forward, and how that translates into European networks and national efforts. And we've seen already, I believe, the first signs on how that cross-boundary transnational collaboration could be sustained or could be achieved through the work of Biodiversity Genomics Europe, relying on the efforts that the communities are making, whether it is within the IBOL Europe network, or within the ERGA network, or within the wider taxonomic network of CETAF. I presented that slide yesterday, and I want to repeat it. I'm not going to read it, but I think it's important. When we talk about those mission statements and those mission-driven approaches, to understand in the path for acceleration and scaling, improving efficiency and effectiveness of the way we do business is super important. This is not just about bringing more money in. This is about doing more with the capabilities we have if we create those economies of scale and the economies of scope that are able to drive efficiency and effectiveness better. And we have two different approaches that we're trying to bring together here in accelerating our impact. We need to understand that this is a multi-actor, multi-stakeholder landscape. We are operating within different environments, whether it is institutional, regional, national, political, cultural. All of that creates a level of complexity that is very important to understand and manage. On one hand, we have what I would call actor-driven approaches. So everything that has to do with working from the bottom up with individual research teams, individual researchers within organizations. And if you want to think about it, this is a let the 100 flowers bloom, if you want to quote Mao. Let people do whatever they feel is important to do. Scientific excellence, innovation, blue skies. In the space of funding, this means funding competition. It means we compete with each other for the same funding source. That's fine. That's a super important aspect of improving scientific excellence and competitiveness. And it's question-driven. It comes from our own needs as scientists to understand the world around us and answer the questions based on our background, our immediate collaborators, or the policies of our institutions and our countries. But there is also a beneficiary-driven approach to missions that actually takes a completely different stance, which is not let the 100 flowers bloom approach, but put a man on the moon approach. That focus is super important, more important than diversity of activities, where funding is orchestrated and coordinated so that it really supports that critical path to delivery. And of course, that is delivery-driven, mostly, rather than question-driven. None of these two approaches independently or on their own can be effective. They need to come together. And this is the difficult part. How did we do this in Europe? Actually, within the European landscape, we have been one of the most successful regions in the world to introduce the solution space, or a potential solution space, combining those two approaches together. To maintain both aspects, whether it is a question-driven approach combined with a delivery-driven approach, competing but at the same time channeling and sustaining funding, and of course looking into a broader area of delivery, allowing at the same time innovation to happen at the bottom. This is what we call the European research infrastructures landscape. We have people in this room that they are very familiar with this. They are operating within the context of the European Strategy Forum of Research Infrastructures. That is a forum that provides advice on many aspects around research infrastructure and their development. But for me, at least, that actor-driven versus beneficiary-driven approach is very well converging within that context of the European infrastructures. So, what are the successful properties of a European research infrastructure? Many people think that these are technical solutions, like just a road or a power network. To some extent they are, but not only. Research infrastructures are way more than that. They act as alliances because they can put forward a shared vision. Think about the global visions of EBP and the Planetary Biodiversity Mission of IBOL. They are put forward advocacy actions representing a wider community of actors. They can help in actually designing joint scientific programming. They act as commons because they are providing shared data infrastructure or shared infrastructure. That's the typical thing you would think about an infrastructure, of course. They can also help in the best practices because in the very essence of the infrastructure, the practice of how you use it is embedded. So it provides a mainstream mechanism through which best practices become the practice. And provide common analytics pipelines when they are needed. They act as federations because they actually are able to connect distributed effort wherever this is happening, at local scale, at regional scale, and federate knowledge. As interoperable network of facilities, especially in a distributed infrastructure. And finally, they act as orchestration mechanisms, in that they can allow the targeted funding allocation, the optimization of project targets, or the recognition and a shared credit system, where everyone contributing in that infrastructure takes their fair share of credit for it. So infrastructures are not just technical constructs, are very elaborate socio-technical structures. And in Europe, we have an amazing portfolio of infrastructures that operate in the wider environmental domain. This is the analysis from the ESFRI roadmap that you will see many of these acronyms. Every single acronym represents a research infrastructure that operates in the different spheres of the environmental domain. So the question ahead is, can we actually benefit from that? Is an infrastructure trajectory for Biodiversity Genomics Europe a trajectory that is suitable for our needs? What does it need? What do we need to do? What is the role of the national organization moving towards this kind of European infrastructures? That national perspective is very, very important. And I think this is something I would like also to discuss. And for that reason, I will invite Elena Buzan to talk about the national perspective or how we can actually bring together capability.
Oh, the big one. Okay, now it works. Thank you. So I would like to just continue what Dimitris was saying in the way of how we can use this capability of the European infrastructure to develop a better national capacity. And I would like to stress again that working in biodiversity genomic infrastructure is not just addressing the technical and scientific issues, but it's also to ensure that there is a fair collaboration among institutions, among countries, strengthening interoperability, and this can bring impactful policy impact and also what we heard, the political impact today. So if we do not invest in national capacity, we can really, what we heard yesterday and today, face the risk that the biodiversity genomics is becoming fragmented across the Europe. Sorry, today my talk is going to be very European-centric because we are talking about how we can develop this in Europe. What does it mean fragmented? Which will do the genomics in the country which can have enough resource, and we cannot do genomics in the countries which are still struggling with the resources. We heard a lot about the Biodiversity Plus today and yesterday, but please keep in mind that there are European countries who are not eligible still for Biodiversity Plus financing. On the other hand, this kind of geographic and resource disparities can come also to slow down the biodiversity genomics and even make biodiversity genomics expensive because there will be less money for R&D if we are not doing and overcome this bottleneck. So all of these can lead to the delay in the processes, of course, in sampling data, especially in those countries which do not have this infrastructure, because in the Huawei we heard we have this world-class lab, really good sequencing center, but in the part of the Europe, which is the biodiversity hotspot, it's mostly Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, we do not have this world-class lab yet. And we do not have, even we heard from the Pete yesterday that there is a low-cost laboratories for a DNA barcoding, but even though we are so far away in some of those countries, and what is the most important, that we are not suffering just not having the equipment and infrastructure. In many cases, we are suffering to have a human resources and very good skilled staff who can do the genomics. And this is probably one of the reasons that we are still lacking these standardized protocols, which we are discussing so much across the Europe, because we are using a different methodology. We're using methodology which we can have in our labs, in the sample collection. We are using the SOPs different, and all of the data and results which are producing, they harder to compare and to reproduce. Another challenge is, of course, always lack of coordination. Even we have this European node, we know that all of the countries, some of them are more engaged in this European node, some are less engaged, and it can be consequence also of the missing of the training and proper training in some of the countries, so which again, it can slow down the decision. Too many times we still see some of the project and initiative which are working in isolation. There are some duplicated effort going on. We saw that this through ERGA development and to the eyeball development. And this kind of, instead of working in synergy across the Europe, we are duplicating the effort, but many times this duplicated effort it's even very hard to compare because of the lack of the training, and again, the people are producing the data in different quality and reproducibility. And on top of that, we are also missing some data, metadata. For many cases, we do not have standardized pipeline how to collect the metadata still on. And this could be also the consequence that those data cannot be used in the long term. So having in mind what is the national capacity, exactly meaning is working in this collaborative network with the proper training, so all the data which are reproduced can be reproduced to the FAIR principle, can be comparable, can be even harmonized, what we heard so many times, but also it's very important that they are open and they are shared publicly. And integration of the data and the workflow is much easier within the country than across the border. We saw that in the BGE project many times that the cross-border collaboration can face some kind of barrier. This barrier can be, of course, first due to some legal and regulatory frameworks like Nagoya, permits, material transfer agreement. But in many times, because keep in mind that not all European countries are part of the European Union, we have these incompatible rules and delay in the cross-border sharing, because we have this, I would say, institutional heterogeneity across, but also the technical heterogeneity which are connected in this institutional heterogeneity across institutions. So how do we use sequencing? Is it a service? Is it a material cost? These are maybe small questions, but sometimes this could be a really struggle for some of the researchers, some institutions, how to solve that. So these are also complicated collaboration. So we heard also quite a lot about the national nodes, and I think the national nodes are really important that we have them all across the Europe, especially I would say stress in those countries which we are missing, and they can really coordinate its national infrastructure, the services, the practices, and they connect the country with existing European infrastructure, which was already mentioned by Dimitris, and it was already mentioned so many times that we need to connect with the other initiative we are working on, the biodiversity monitoring. So having this two-way knowledge flow between, I would say, through the national nodes, to the national, I would say, insight that the national requests come into the European agenda and back forward that the European regulation and standards can be implemented nationally is very important. And I think that having this kind of interconnection through the European infrastructure and through the, which can be included into this note, is very important future for the biodiversity genomics. So the transition, how do we see maybe the transition to, but this is also open to discussion, to the European interoperability. We already have set up the national node, and I think that this bidirectional knowledge is also set in through the Biodiversity Genomics Europe project, but now we're coming to this important middle part, which is mean integration. Integration to adopt the share policy. We heard a lot about the standard pipeline, standard protocol, standard workflow, metadata, validated pipelines, trusted repository, but also it's important in this integration that we integrate biodiversity genomics with the already existing research infrastructure in Europe, which are working on the other aspect of the biodiversity monitoring, like DISCO, like ELIXIR, LifeWatch, and Dimitris showed many, many others. And of course, having this, then we can discuss about the compliance, the technical compliance, and the compliance with all legal and the policy frameworks. So how we are going to do that? Despite we think that we know very well our users and their needs, maybe we are not so close to it, because also I think today and yesterday during this conference we heard a lot about the private sector and the requests from the private sector. So maybe even though some things we didn't think about before, so we need to really know very well our users and our needs. So we need to map those, put a lot of emphasis, what we heard about, on our stakeholders, coming from the research, but I would say also the practitioners, the policy agency, and of course at the end, even the citizen scientists and local communities, because all of them, they have specific needs and the specific requirement, and each of them, they can have this unique contribution to the biodiversity genomic landscape. We are all agree with that, but we need to find out what exactly our users need, and how we can even represent them, how we can solve their needs. And this is the best way to prepare the service portfolio. And maybe this is also what Amber was saying. Let us discuss what we can offer. So how we can develop this service portfolio, which we said it should include genomic data services, analytical platform, training application, and again, policy and compliance. But having the flexible service portfolio is only possible if we include this national picture. So having the national insight, it's really important to start to develop the service portfolio of the biodiversity genomics. So having the insight from the policymakers, from other stakeholders who are really using the biodiversity genomic and having in mind an eyeball or ERGA, it's important to develop the portfolio. So just to summarize to the end, so what we would like to do if we would be funded in the next BGE project is, of course, to understand better and to map the user needs, start to collaborate and try to research the possibility in the connection, in integration with the existing European infrastructure, including into the service portfolio, which we can develop together, even with some of those infrastructure national capacity. And I think that the future service portfolio wouldn't be just scientific excellence, but also will give what we were discussing this today, this policy stream, and maybe in the future, in 10 years, even political stream.
Thank you, Elena, very much. Please don't leave. I need you. Thank you very much, and thanks especially for presenting the service aspect, which is a fundamental attribute, of course, of every infrastructure, and the need to understand what are the service gaps and what is the service portfolio from the national perspective as well. We will have the opportunity to ask questions to Elena because she's going to be in our panel. So I would like to invite you to take a seat in the panel. Elena is a professor at the University of Primorska, and she's, as you heard, a very experienced person also in understanding how national efforts are better organized. But Elena is not going to be on her own, hopefully, on the panel. But it's also okay if you're on your own, I guess. So, so for backup, I would like also to invite, I have in the list here, I know them, but I want to make sure that it's properly. Let's do this. Andy Smith. Andy Smith is the head of external relations at ELIXIR, so one of those research infrastructures that you've seen on the slide, and one of the infrastructure that really supports cross-domain many research communities, not only the environment community, but also the life and medical community. He will have the opportunity to talk about ELIXIR more. I would like to also invite Anna Casino. Anna, you may. Anna is the executive director of CETAF, but also here on, which is the network of all the taxonomic facilities and museums in Europe. But here she will wear also her hat as the deputy director of DISCO, another European research infrastructure that you've seen up there, and we hope that could have a role in this discussion. And finally, but definitely not least, I would like to invite Gert Verreet. Gert is the chair of the environment group of the European Strategy Forum on Research Infrastructures, and is the person who is more knowledgeable about the landscape and the portfolio for infrastructures that connect to the environment. Thank you all. Now you have to wait for 1 minute to bring up my questions. Okay, obviously we want to discuss about a few things. The first thing I would like to understand is, we're talking about the landscape, and this is a question I will start with Anna and Andy. We saw a landscape of infrastructures. We tried to describe what infrastructures are, although I don't think that's enough for people many times to understand the value and the position of these infrastructures. But my question to you, you're both involved in two of them, DISCO and ELIXIR. And I would like to ask you, what are, you think, the key characteristics and benefits of a European research infrastructure, and what are the main challenges in building or connecting with one from the point of view of the needs of a community like the biodiversity genomics community? So what I'm trying to understand is, when we're talking about a new research infrastructure approach, are we talking about creating a new one to add it in the portfolio of Gert, or are we talking about something that could be a carrier of the needs of the community moving forward? So Anna, from your perspective, how would you approach it? And maybe you can say a few things about DISCO if you wish as well.
Yes, talk? Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. But let's start with the first part of your question, which was the addressing also ELIXIR and DISCO together. Which are the characteristics? Because perhaps we can then align perfectly with your presentation, because I think that the research infrastructure is that instrument that you presented that has proven to be very powerful to pool resources, to pool experts, to pool also funding. So I think that these research infrastructures are there to be used. And I would like to just highlight two main characteristics that, for instance, for DISCO, from our perspective, are very, very important. The first one is collaboration. A research infrastructure is by nature a collaborative effort. It entails a community, a collaborative community. It entails to have stakeholders involved, entails to have also governments and national commitments, and at the very end is a coordinated, a collaborative effort. But the second main characteristic of the research infrastructures that I would like to highlight is convergence. We need to have somehow to lower the barriers for users to access the data that we produce. And that means to coordinate our efforts. To coordinate, meaning harmonize, having standards. We have heard a lot about these features. Having common frameworks, having a very much harmonized structure under which our knowledge can be produced, shared, and openly be accessible for everyone. So I think that that convergence, because we have very, very many initiatives, and this becomes very complex for the user's perspective. And we need to somehow harmonize. So let's summarize, is convergence, but it's also collaboration that is underpinning a research infrastructure. This is what it entails for DISCO. DISCO as a research infrastructure that is still in its process to become a legal entity, but perhaps, Andy, you have also an additional perspective for that. Huh?
Yeah, sure, thanks, Anna. So ELIXIR is on the part of the ESFRI roadmap that is classed as food and health, okay? But we work very closely with the environmental research infrastructures, DISCO, LifeWatch, and others as well. So we cover quite a broad area, so from biodiversity through to rare diseases. So we are funded through 21 member states, and EMBL is also a member of it. And so we have 700 services that our national partners provide: databases, tools, registries, national computing facilities, standards, ontologies, workflows, and so on. And so the real aim of ELIXIR, and the reason the member states wanted to establish a European entity in this space, was really to help countries build their national life science data capacities and then to connect them with each other. So already for a number of years in Europe, there has been really very strong and mature national coordination efforts. So ROB's organization, the Swiss Institute for Bioinformatics, for example, that coordinates world-class bioinformatics services in Switzerland. The European Bioinformatics Institute, which runs resources like ENA, which you all know of. So there has been a lot of excellent service provision and coordination that happens in countries, but member states felt they wanted to take this to the next level and help new countries where there wasn't as much coordination, and then help to create a European entity that could connect those infrastructures together and also then collaborate with other infrastructures in different scientific disciplines and domains. So that was the value proposition for the member states in creating ELIXIR. And then to build on and come back to the original question from Dimitris. So for me, if the question is what's the difference between a research project and a ESFRI research infrastructure, for me, there's a few factors. The first one is really the need for permanence. So we recognize, don't we, that there are lots of high-value European projects. They start, they finish. In some cases, there's a momentum and a community behind them, and they can continue in future years. And they might be connecting existing infrastructures together, or they might be generating new research. But I think the thing to consider when a new research infrastructure is needed is how important is that entity over the long term. So not a 2, 3, 4 year research project. So that's one thing. It's the need for this over the long term. And I think we can also see that research projects are very effective in building a community of scientists in a particular domain. But I would say a research infrastructure, an effective one, brings those scientists together and also the funders. And I think that's the difference that leads to longer term sustainability as well. That also gives the community a far more powerful voice. So if you want to put out position papers, public statements, where you can say you're representing 1,000 bioinformaticians and 21 funding agencies, the statement that you're making is far more powerful as well. So I think there are a few thoughts about the difference between a research project that has value in itself and the permanence of an entity that exists legally. And there are different legal forms that can be taken, and we can come back to different options there. But I think that's how I would summarize the thought process that needs to go into whether a new entity needs to be created or not.
Thank you. Thanks both. Gert, I will come to you. This community, at least in the context of the, let me rephrase it, in the context of the Biodiversity Genomics Europe project, we have evaluated the different options for future trajectory of the needs and how we serve the needs of this community. And we have identified the infrastructure path as a viable path. But of course, I do understand, and that's why I want to ask you, that there are multiple options through which we can serve these needs of the community. We can discuss about, as I implied before, about the need for a new one to understand how it sits and where it would sit in the landscape, or, as I heard, understand how existing infrastructures could serve a new community coming on. So I would like to ask you, in your knowledge and experience as the chair of the environment working group, what are the differences? What are the key differences between one route and the other? Why would the community choose to go one way or the other?
Okay, thank you. Well, first and foremost, thank you for inviting me to participate in this reflection. I'm not very familiar with this part of this type of science, but I'm a generalist, so I should swim my way through your question. I think I would like to, if I may, give a few elements of information also while I try to respond to your question, because they are important for your decisions on how to go forward. I think in the European landscape, the ESFRI system exists now for almost 20 years. So from 2006, that was the first roadmap. And basically the roadmap is the collective document that signals to the countries that I mean, ESFRI is a participatory forum between the member states and associated countries and the EU to decide on the strategic perspective for the future of research infrastructures. And so it exists since 2006. The ERIC regulation that sort of gives the opportunity to become a legal entity to those research infrastructures exists since 2009. And in that time since then, 30 plus infrastructures have adopted this ERIC framework. And basically, they've chosen the path. I mean, in ESFRI, we have the idea of there's a sort of life cycle of a research infrastructure. You start with something, you build it up, you develop it, you become operational, implementation, and so on. And eventually, if you're irrelevant, you will be decommissioned. Now, we're only, for most of the research infrastructures, of course, we are still on that path, and there have been very few that have been decommissioned. But because of the, let's say, evolving landscape that is growing, there is, of course, a continuous reflection of how can we optimize the system in terms of the decision making for new research infrastructures, and also in terms of, well, making sure that the landscape, and you, I mean, I was very glad that you mentioned efficiency and effectiveness, because of course there are key concepts that underpin also the discussion about, well, if they become too many research infrastructures, then they start to be sort of competing with each other again, rather than each being a single big thing that can do what they're supposed to be doing, which is indeed advance excellent science. But on top of excellent science, they need to have many other outcomes. Societal outcomes is becoming a much more significant part of the discussion than only excellent science. Now, in the space that we're in time-wise, we're moving from Horizon Europe to Framework Program 10, the next Horizon Europe. The Commission has, in its proposal, shifted the research infrastructures into another pillar. They're not only no longer only relevant in the excellent science pillar, and that has to do with the fact that the Commission connects, and I think many at the political level in research policy connect research infrastructure also with the notion of competitiveness. Competitiveness in the sense that the research infrastructures are key infrastructures that are enablers for our knowledge base in Europe to remain competitive at global level in whatever shape or form. Competitive not only for the quality of the science produced here, but also for what that means for society, for businesses, that they have trained workforce, that they have all kinds of tools that they can access. There's a paper out from the Commission a few weeks, well, I think 15th of September or so, the strategy for research and technology infrastructures. So there is also a whole policy debate ongoing that whether or not the classical research infrastructures will take up a role in the space of being providers of technological support for new tools and services. And I think you're, of course, your type of science, and that is very much technology related, of course. So basically rolling out, well, new types of sensors and all those sort of things I think is also part of your community. Your stakeholder community includes a strong element of technology interest. So I think you should look into that as well. And of course, the policy debate hasn't yet finished. It's only just started on technology infrastructures and how they should be conceptualized and what the rules should be, etc. But that is important, I think, for you to know. Now, in the environment domain where I work, indeed, the element of consolidation is very strong in the minds of people. The people who are not directly linked to one, there are 6 thematic domains in ESFRI: environment, health and food, social sciences and humanities, energy, physics and engineering, and I'm forgetting one now, data, yeah, indeed, digit. So these, if you're not directly linked to any of these domains, the perspective of people is very much, well, environment, they're all very small, they're all very not really able to scale themselves up. There's only one that is a single-sited research infrastructure, ISCAT 3D, that's to do with atmospheric things up in the north. The others are all distributed research infrastructures that their key strength, of course, is that they are strong networks, but their struggle in life is to become more than networks and to become really the research infrastructures that provide all these different elements that you mentioned, that have a strong focus on service for external users. And I think the real thing that makes them effective and efficient is that that the incentives are okay for all the actors that are part of that system. And I mean with that, if you're a distributed research infrastructure, the national nodes and the national operators need to see that when participating in the research infrastructure, it has a return for them. But not for the funders, it's something different. For the funders, it is about, are we getting something extra on top of what is already there? So the thing is, can you define very crucially the added value at European level from what you are already here? I mean, I know there is heterogeneous distribution of competence and of capabilities across Europe. Only the element of saying we want to homogenize and have bring all the levels of capability to the same level in Europe, that in itself is not going to be a sufficient argument to become a European research infrastructure. It needs to have an added value. And I mentioned one example. In EMBRC, which is one of your partner organizations dealing with eDNA and also EMOBON, the EMOBON project was basically started to say, look, we need to get out of this mindset that we're only offering, let's say, excess capacity of our labs. Excess capacity of labs is not going to make it work. So you need to really have a unique selling proposition in the sense of what services, and then I would, to keep it shorter, read the guidebook for the 2026 roadmap that we're preparing at the moment. There's a public document online, ESFRI.eu, look at roadmap 2026. So the public guide specifies all the requirements and basically all the dimensions of a research infrastructure. And basically, when you apply to get onto the roadmap, the column preparation, you should, the sentences that are in that column, you should live up to all those requirements at that stage that you apply.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Gert. You talked about services, and I think that's very important, and how we understand the added value or the value proposition through the perspective of services. And Elena was talking about services before, and how we are going through a process through which we understand what is the required service portfolio. Elena, you have also, you're leading a part of this work within the BGE Plus project. What is your understanding on how to go about to really capture that from the community, for instance, in relation to, for instance, the national nodes, the needs of the nodes, or the dispersed needs of the different countries and how they operate? How are you going to do this?
Yeah, this is a tricky question. So one of the things that I already said, it's really important that we understand who are our users and what are their needs. So this is the starting point. But then having this national capacity, building on this, what we heard before, even the other infrastructure, we shouldn't forget one important point, that each country then can negotiate on European level what is their strategic opportunity for the future. And this should come from the national institution, from the national need, from the national node. Do we really need a biodiversity genomics as an important service to the European landscape? And I can share my experience. On the other hand, what is very important, even we were discussing quite a lot about the Europe and what is this interoperability of data is really important. And the infrastructure brings to the national capacity one important aspect. Not only, and I'm saying this because we have a luck that we are in the ERIC legal infrastructure, which is recognized by our Ministry of Higher Education. And it means for us as the researchers that we are really having this support for the work we are doing. And I'm not thinking here about just the support for maintaining the equipment, but also for the R&D, which means if the country recognizes that the biodiversity genomics is important for the strategy, for their development, for the incorporation in the digital society, it means that the country will give the money for the maintenance, the knowledge, and increasing the skills in the national level. What does it mean? It means a really long-term funding, which come from the policy, and it means also not only the long-term funding, which is coming on the yearly basis, and we are discussing here, like we heard in Europe, we cannot discuss about billions, we discuss about the millions, but even though if this is a strategic aspect of the country, we can have additional project, additional inclusion on all of these European mechanisms, Horizon, Biodiversity, Cohesion, which are really important for the researchers to develop R&D in this aspect. So having a clear service portfolio is not only important for the ESFRI to apply for this new ESFRI, but it's also very important for us as a scientist on national level to start a discussion with our policy and our what will be the political will of the country to support this. I think this is bottom-up approach it's really important and we shouldn't forget. I agree there will be new pillar with ESFRI and there will be even more funding, I think, in the next framework program, but still having this national node and having this, I was strong community in IBOL and ERGA. We did this for the last 5-6 years, at least intensively, and recently also through the BGE project, is something we should appreciate, and we really need to find our position on national level then to easily negotiate to the European level.
Yes, you're totally right. It's a bottom-up system, and that's a good point, but it also has its limits because, of course, it's a variable geometry system, which means that in the different research infrastructures, the membership of the countries is different, and that makes it also difficult to have the conversations between them about how to go forward. But it's a basic requirement, but it's not in itself sufficient. I think it has to have this European added value element that, I mean, and I think I mean, in your slide with the two differences, the user-driven or the delivery, the beneficiary-driven. I mean, in Europe we have missions, but we have forgotten to think about leadership in the mission. So we need a little bit more top-down sometimes in certain types of enterprise, because you cannot achieve a certain goal if you leave it all. If you can only work with competitive funding instruments, for instance, because each time there is a funding cycle, you're again in an existential crisis, you might not get the funding. So that is, I mean, ESFRI is trying to overcome that, but the thing is, at the moment, is the budget restrictions in many countries. They are becoming much more restrictive on adding new infrastructures. So the route of using what's already there and trying to find an elegant and efficient and so on way of cooperating between existing ones is certainly something, a very interesting option that you should really explore very clearly.
Thank you. Thanks. Anna, Andy, and then if you have questions, please, yeah, I will will come to you. Yeah, Anna and Andy first.
I would like to continue on that, because it's not only because of the shortage of budget, but also for the aim to multiply the impact of the research infrastructure of the communities, that we should explore very, very in detail the possibility of leveraging on existing initiatives. And I would like to, perhaps I gave by granted that everyone knew about DISCO. DISCO is a research infrastructure that is becoming a legal entity within months, we hope. And DISCO has been established. Its value proposition is to have a unique entry point for biodiversity data. Based on physical specimens, we are building the digital surrogates, the common space for all the digital data that can be linked to specimens in biodiversity data. So this existing infrastructure is something that, in fact, has been built on a multi-layer, on a federated system that allows aggregating new types and new classes of data. So this is something that we should explore more in detail, to multiply, and I insist on that, to multiply the impact and to lower the barrier of complexity for users, for potential users, and I'm not talking only about scientists, but also I'm talking about policymakers that are looking for biodiversity data from an integrative perspective. They don't want to look for a single stream of knowledge. They want to really understand biodiversity as a whole with all the data and metadata that we can be able to aggregate. And DISCO aims to be that entry point. So really merging taxonomic, integrative taxonomic perspective all together can make the efforts much, much more impactful. I would like
Thank
to
you, Andy. Yes, and then we will take Olga's question, but I'm not sure. What time do we have to? We're already late. Okay.
So just to follow on, and I completely concur with panelists about the importance of starting by trying to understand the needs of the communities in terms of what services they want. That has to be the starting point. So that could be the community needs services that don't currently exist, and so some new services may need to be created. It could be that some services are there, but they need a major upgrade and more investments. Or it could be that groups of services are there, but they need more integration with each other. And that is the starting point to try and articulate what the needs are of those communities, starting from the services. Then based on that, it's a question of how can you best achieve it? Is that connecting existing infrastructures? Or is that creating a new one? And then
What do you think?
Well, I would, so let me finish, and I'll illustrate with two examples of the process that we have to go through to reach this conclusion, because it is tempting to automatically want to create a new research infrastructure, and we have to think of the costs that come with that. So ELIXIR was added to the ESFRI roadmap in 2006. A few years after that, there was a systems biology ESFRI research infrastructure added. And for a research infrastructure to be effective, there needs to be a critical mass of countries that are taking part in it, because that's what differentiates it between a project and a permanent infrastructure. And so one of the challenges that the community of systems biologists found was trying to convince the funders of why this research infrastructure was needed, because there are systems biology communities in ELIXIR, there are modeling databases in ELIXIR already, and so it was a very difficult proposition to try and get to sell to funders as to why there needed to be a new entity with separate funding streams. And of course, once you do that, you start creating a secretariat, you need to employ people, you need to put in place governance, and that all comes at a cost. And then there's also the cost of having to join up between them. So I would say the default should never be, we need to create a new entity. The default should always be, let's start by seeing what's already there and connecting them. Now that could be through projects, cluster projects, better connections on the ESFRI roadmap. There are different mechanisms to make this happen. But at the same time, there could be some reasons why you do need a new legal entity to be created. And so if I jump to the human world, so there's the European Health Data Space and activities to try and share access to 1 million genomes across Europe. And so at the moment, most of those human genomes are being generated in a research context. And so ELIXIR, with its national partners, is very active in coordinating this landscape. But in the future, most of those genomes are going to come from clinics, hospitals, healthcare settings, and then it starts moving away from a research infrastructure into a different domain. And so the community, the member states, the existing research infrastructures are reaching an agreement that a new legal entity does need to be created. And so there, it started with a discussion about what will the future trends be. The genomes are going to be in healthcare and clinics, therefore it can't be an existing research infrastructure. There still needs to be mechanisms to connect, because what we want is to make sure that the research data and healthcare data are interoperable. So there needs to be mechanisms to connect, ensure data interoperability, but in that case, a new legal entity is the preferred model of the member states and the community.
Perfect. Thanks very much. Olga, I'll
Thank you so much. So Olga Winner-Pettersson, and here I represent the SciLife Lab, which is Swedish National Infrastructure for Molecular Life Sciences. But I will take off my Swedish hat and put my Latvian hat, which is my second country. And I would like to raise an important question of genome sovereignty and neocolonialism. And I think the added value of the proposed BGE Plus that we want to connect the widening countries with extremely rich biodiversity and ensure that they have the capacity to produce genomes in their own country, thus ensuring the genome sovereignty. And we know that Global North has all the technologies and know-hows how to produce the genomes, but if we'll stay there and without developing it further into the East and South, we'll find out that we will end up in the novel, this new colonialism situation where people will lose track of their samples, and it will be Sanger and SciLife Lab in France who would be sequencing all the East and South genomes. But about that, speaking about that, the existing infrastructures that I would like to ask, how do you address these questions? Do you have any experience? Do you have any words of wisdom for us in case if we get BGE Plus? How should we address these matters? Thank you.
Who wants to, from the existing infrastructures or the national perspective? I mean, Olga talks about essentially the value of a distributed infrastructure here and what it means potentially.
Yeah, so in a way, this topic is similar to the previous panel about capacity building, isn't it? And so, okay, next week I'm in Latvia. I'm working with the Latvian ministry to try and get them to become a member of ELIXIR. So they're part of ESFRI, but they haven't become formal members of many ESFRI research infrastructures. And so I think part of this is about trying to convince the respective ministries of science about the added value of becoming a member of research infrastructures, and importantly, about trying to utilize some national funding. And so quite often you'll see a country is committed, or they will see the scientific benefits, and certainly the community will, of becoming a member, but there isn't a corresponding allocation of budget to be able to become a member of it. And so I think that Latvia and other countries who on a similar path, they probably need to better use some of their national structural funds, especially if actually one of the gaps is being able to access those sequencing technologies. So we do see in Estonia, for example, they've been, in our case, using very effectively national funding to be able to build capacity to connect to European research infrastructures. So there are things that can be done.
Someone else, or shall we?
Yeah, perhaps mentioning the one of the features of the research infrastructure is the inclusivity. Everyone is called to be partner. Perhaps not all the communities can fund that research infrastructure. And we have seen in many cases that the research infrastructure is funded by several countries, but the community and the participatory schema behind the research infrastructure is open to everyone. And this is, for instance, the case of DISCO. DISCO might be as a NERIC, as a legal entity, be supported by certain number of countries. But the community behind united, well, more than over 200 institutions from basically 24 countries. So it is much more than just the funding and the leveraging of European and national funding. It's the community effort that also counts, and that links to the inclusivity. If we want to deliver integrative knowledge about biodiversity, we need to engage with those countries that perhaps are not at the same speed in terms of funding or even in terms of technology, but they are really hot spots in terms of biodiversity. So those are really there.
A quick one.
Yeah, we see in the ESFRI system anyway that there is more interest from eastern side of Europe and also Turkey, for instance, to foster and to become part of the family. And I mean, everybody's learning from everybody else, I suppose. And yes, I mean, a project like this one is, of course, also very helpful to prepare the ground for it. But indeed, the national, I mean, there is always a national element that you need to convince national politicians that it matters to be part of the family. There are countries that are maybe small and have very little resources, but they can think of themselves that they don't need any participation. For instance, Luxembourg, I don't think is in any of the research infrastructures because they probably have everything they need for themselves. There are big countries that are also not very well represented in some of the larger ESFRI's. So it is really a national choice very often.
Hello, David Eckers from Waardenburg Ecology. Yeah, I hear a lot in the talks that you talk about accessibility and end users. But I don't really hear that much about like how we actually translate this to the actual granular level. So I was thinking about my own company. We do a lot of ecological research, not only related to genomics, but also just traditional ecological research. And a lot of this research, we actually log this data in an app where this data is shared between all users. And all of this sort of metadata that we generate, we share among each other, and it becomes accessible for everybody. And I was thinking this type of a model where you provide accessibility to genomics data also for non-genomics experts, is that something that you are thinking about, and also thinking about tools, technology tools like smartphone apps to really lower the threshold of accessibility, so to say?
Elena.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can explain to you, but yeah, we think about that, especially the eyeball. They have these citizen science initiatives, which they are really engaged with the citizen scientists who are collecting the data, they're sharing the results, because we know that citizen science by definition is not just a data collection, but also include them. So in this aspect, yes. Regarding the genomic stream, everything we publish is a part of the ENA, European Nucleotide Archive, so it's publicly available. I know it's difficult when somebody saw that the genome assembly, they will non-users who are not experts, they are not going to understand. So we are working in this direction in the future to develop a better training, the knowledge hub. There is a really nice initiative in Australia, Threatened Species Initiative, where they have the specific forum for the stakeholders, for the practitioners, as trying to explain genomics is in very easiest way, and also they include also this kind of data sharing. So this is the one of the good practice. We were thinking also about that in future, and we start to develop this. So we go towards also to including non-expert users in genomics in this way to the diverse stakeholders, because as you said, there are many people who look genomic as a black box. They don't want to see what is there, they just want to see the results. We heard about the policy, but also people who are citizen scientists, like who are collecting the data, they would like to know the results, but they are not interested in what is happening in the lab. And I agree with you, maybe some kind of digitalization can improve this kind of the data connection with I would say the faster connection with the data. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, partially, but one aspect that I particularly like about the app that we are using is that it also creates a relationship where we are as users also stakeholders, because we provide information to this app because it provides us accessibility to the entire data set. And I think that aspect could be a very interesting thing to look at on the granular level, or at least at a low level. How do you motivate commercial entities, for instance, as well, but also citizen science to actually participate?
But this is exactly what we have in mind to define even in those service portfolio. I don't know if it's going to be app or some kind of other aspect, but I agree with you that there should be some kind of way to bring those data close to the others.
A research infrastructure operates as a private entity, essentially in terms as a company, in the sense that its value comes from the use of its services. So if our services as an infrastructure is not being used, there is no value. So it is in its best interest to understand and survey the users, and that's usually what infrastructures are doing. The first thing is create those use cases, the user stories, the user journeys, understand what are the functionality and the properties of the services they need to offer and how they recalibrate them as they move on and engage with other audiences.
Yeah, very good point. So I was wondering also in this line of thought, because we are, as ecologists in the Netherlands at least, ecological consultancy companies, we're using already a lot of apps that everybody is very well integrated to. So in the light of not reinventing the wheel, maybe it could also be interesting to look at these apps that already have a very large consortium of people used to using these. Maybe it would be easier to adapt those.
I'm sorry to take in, but the concept of a distributed infrastructure is exactly that they can already onboard existing solutions and ensure that basically they become part of a more integrated service portfolio.
Yes, I mean, a research infrastructure is part of the landscape. I mean, the downstream in terms of users, like for environmental monitoring or something, is a different part of the landscape, if you like, because the research infrastructure funding, I mean, the funders are, of course, critically interested in knowing what is the difference that this organization as a research infrastructure makes for research, not for the downstream users. Although everybody thinks there has to be a societal benefit from the downstream. But I mean, the space that you occupy is not to be the routine monitoring system of Europe or something like that. That is not what is envisaged. I mean, European research funding does the heavy lifting for getting the new technologies off the ground, but once it becomes a mainstream thing, it's no longer really the business of a research infrastructure, I would say.
Okay, thanks, Dimitris. I'm David Castle. I chair the External Expert Advisory Board to the BGE project. I'm based in Canada. I work for the Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister, and I also have an academic appointment. I think maybe this is an overblown concern, but I think we should address it anyway, which is that a lot of countries worldwide just don't actually have roadmaps for research infrastructure. And one of the things that I think tends to happen is that even if they're interested in participating in research infrastructures, what they find is that their mechanisms for funding are actually basically project-based funding, and you can anticipate all of the problematic misalignments with project-based funding as it bumps up against a research infrastructure, which is meant to actually do different things, different time horizons, different KPIs in terms of what they're actually supposed to support. So when we think about something like a biodiversity genomics infrastructure in Europe, I can sort of see some pitfalls in some countries thinking that biodiversity genomics is important, but not understanding how to take it out of a project-based funding model and think seriously about actually contributing to enduring research infrastructures. And so, Andy, I take your distinction about project-based versus infrastructure-based. Makes a lot of sense from the administration of infrastructures, makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of the user base and user communities, but it's not always very clear for funders. And I'm wondering whether or not you might have some practical advice about going forward with trying to develop biodiversity genomics infrastructure that will avoid some of these problem areas that I have seen arise before that have, it may seem like, I guess the temptation is, well, let's at least get a 3 or 5 year project-based funding commitment from a country to support a pan-European infrastructure. But the problem is in 3 to 5 years, you're going to be bumping up against life cycle, you're going to be bumping up against reporting that are total misalignments to what research infrastructures are actually meant to do. So how would you help us avoid some of these pitfalls?
Yeah, thanks, David. So I'll describe a bit more the situation in Europe and how it varies between countries, and then flip back to Canada. So ESFRI has been incredibly successful in providing a governance framework that's allowed scientific communities to approach national funding agencies. So just because a country as part of the ESFRI process, they don't have an obligation to join any individual ESFRI research infrastructure, and that's right, okay? But what we would hope is that more countries will think more seriously about becoming members of research infrastructures by having a roadmap that is up to date. And if you look on the ESFRI website, you'll see some countries that have a very frequently updated process, where there's a roadmap that is maybe updated every 2, 3, 4 years. And you've got some countries that have been part of the ESFRI process where there isn't yet a publicly available roadmap for that country. And then you've got some countries where the roadmap exists, but where they haven't subsequently joined any research infrastructures because they haven't been able to mobilize any funding to do it. And it is a very difficult proposition to get taxpayers' funding sent to a different jurisdiction. And fundamentally, that's one of the challenges. But it is possible over time, and as ESFRI continues to mature, and as those countries that struggle with it at the moment can try to utilize other funding through structural funds to be able to do this, you can see more developments happening. And then also, I would say really positively, so Canada became an associate member of ESFRI very recently. So probably triggered by what's happening in the US and the need to connect to other countries. But I think that's really quite significant. And that shows actually that ESFRI and what's happened in Europe is now a model for other countries to connect to. And so we work very closely with Genome Canada and also the Ministry of Education. And so there are funding agencies that do have longer term infrastructure programs. And the fact that now Canada has become an associate member of ESFRI, I think starts to open up far more opportunities for those individual ESFRIs on the roadmap to be able to start looking at whether Canada can become a formal member of those. So it can take time, but I think that momentum is moving in the right direction.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So I'm really struck by the need to bring together the two conversations that we've had this morning, that a lot of the language here has been about research infrastructures, but our conversation earlier was about moving from research into actually deployment and operations and business. And, you know, from that's where my perspective comes from. So, you know, I think we need to join together those two things. I understand why the word research is being used, because that's probably what's needed for the people who will fund it and the funding sources. I really like to think about how we can develop that so that there is not a disconnect between that and between the, you know, what was referred to as the kind of downstream applications of it.
I fully agree. I think, I mean, having biodiversity conservation policy participation in the development would be super important for this to happen. It just is the case that environmental policy in Europe doesn't allow to have this sort of infrastructural component somewhere in the system. You have a European Environment Agency, we have the GRC with all kinds of knowledge hubs and things like that, but we don't have a space in Europe where you can have both the development, the service to the science users and service to other stakeholder communities that can be user communities. So, I mean, the combination would be really important to develop and to see. I mean, also in terms of the funding, because the long-term the business plan could also be affected by that there is downstream use from these specific user communities that are willing to contribute to the funding, to the business model.
But I would like to insist on the fact that a research infrastructure is not serving a unique scientific community. They have their value proposition exactly to serve and to have and to improve the cross-fertilization towards something else. Policymakers, we are talking about business, we are talking about many other stakeholders that are users of the data and the services that the research infrastructure provides, but is based and is rooted on the knowledge creation. That's the most important thing. Who can make use of that through the research infrastructure? That's the users' cases that we can build together with the value proposition of that research infrastructure. And I want to make the point that policymakers need those research infrastructure to channel how to use, better use, more efficiently use also that knowledge, to make that knowledge actionable. But it's not serving a unique scientific community. That's something very, very important.
Yep, thank you. I will have some personal consideration. So yeah, the EU is complex. The European Commission is complex. Horizon Europe is complex, and Horizon Europe for biodiversity is complex, where you have the partnerships, the missions, the topics. We have some research projects via the LIFE program and not Horizon Europe. And then the link between science policy, we have new bodies, so the EU Biodiversity Platform, the Knowledge Center for Biodiversity, its science service, it's complex. But on your side, you are complex too. So the infrastructure community, when you are not an expert, it's very difficult to understand. The same for many other communities like taxonomy, digitalization, artificial intelligence, environmental observations, genomics. And then we, on our side, are launching new initiatives. So bioeconomy strategy, life science strategy, the Biotech Act. So it's a mess. We can say it's a big mess, but there are many, many opportunities. But for that, we really need that everybody, including us within the Commission, we understand and we really need to know where to go. So if I have that kind of question, I have to go to ELIXIR. If I have this kind of question, it's more for BGE, etc. And so the big question is what Europe can do for you, but also what you can do for Europe. We really need to work hand in hand, so bottom up and also from the top. And on your side, it's very, very important that all of you, you are ambassadors in your own countries, including for national fundings, as Dimitris mentioned. And actually right now, when you look at the political landscape, we have to change the narrative. So it's about competitiveness angle, startups, jobs, etc. It's doable with all the things we have for biodiversity, but we have also to underline what was agreed under the Global Biodiversity Framework. Protect, restore, and sustainably use biodiversity. This is the key message that we should not forget. And one very last thing, we are using more and more the One Health approach to also speak about biodiversity. And so under the life science strategy, we are trying to make all the connections in terms of data between GBIF, for example, but also the Global Biodata Coalition. So we really want to include all the data, including the data on us. Thank you.
Looking at the time, I think with the words from the Commission, we can maybe conclude. It's appropriate, if nothing else. I would like to join me to thanking our panelists and speaker. Thank you very much. I will give the floor to Rob and Pete, where they will try to make a summary out of this and have the final word.
Okay, so we've made it to the end of our symposium. I really like your final summary there, Gilles. It's a mess. And at least we got maybe some insights into the mess and maybe some of the organization as well. Firstly, from the perspective of our communities, So from the reference genome community, from the barcoding community, and from the taxonomic community to start off with. Also reflecting a little bit on what we've managed to achieve through the BGE project and through our wider communities in terms of the latest developments in genomics for biodiversity. Then we moved from our communities into touching on some of the applications, so the downstream applications of these genomic technologies. And it was really great that we had such great representation from different examples of applying genomics technologies to understand and monitor biodiversity. Of course, we only touched on a few. There are many, many others out there, and we are, through the people in this room, well connected, I think, to some of the main players out there who are advancing these technologies, some of which we heard about yesterday. Then this morning we started with, okay, where are we going next in terms of really trying to mainstream the use of some of these technologies all the way through policy and eventually into politics. And then finally, in this last session, we sort of took a step backwards in thinking about how we wish to organize this in the European sphere, if you like, and the European mechanisms that we have in place to get organized, to formalize community activities into something a little bit more structured that involves country participation and bringing together the key players. So that's the kind of topics that we wanted to address. I saw a lot of people in the coffee breaks and in the lunch breaks actually making these connections, discussing what was discussed in some of the sessions, but also their latest achievements, which is really, really great. As this is Biodiversity Genomics Connects, I think at least we achieved making a few extra connections. Then I hand over to Pete for the last bit.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I mean, I think it's just been a series of absolutely fascinating presentations, sharing an enormous amount of expertise, ideas, and wisdom, and I found it a wonderful couple of days. I mean, some of the key words that I wrote down were reference libraries are fundamental, equitable access, capacity building, new baselines, us getting the narrative right, us making our discipline accessible, and that's kind of practically accessible, but it's also terminologically accessible, being clear about what we're doing. And this amazing set of discussions around the journey from R&D to delivery for policy implementation, delivery for business. And I kind of got that sense that was really important today, that the different bits are going to move at different paces. In some cases, it's a kind of straightforward route for taking these approaches to implement existing policies, and there those standards are key, especially in that regulatory settings. In other cases, it's going to be a slower burn, a longer journey, but an extremely exciting one, because we're just getting an entirely new view on nature, and that there will be all sorts of opportunities that come with that. And so in this last session, I mean, I kind of, it's very clear. This field is big enough to think beyond projects. I think that's really clear. This cannot just be a sum of projects, and we hope that there is some kind of emerging property from that. We've seen the great successes from some very successful projects. So now the key thing is, how do we move towards this more systematic investment in an infrastructure in whatever form? I felt like I've been at school in this last session. There's a lot I didn't know about infrastructures that I now know about infrastructures, and I'm very grateful for that. And we've been chatting about, so where do we go from here? I mean, one thing is I will certainly go away feeling kind of very stimulated and informed by all of these exchanges, but we want it to be something a bit more substantial than that. So I think, just in terms of practical terms for a next step, that what we'll try and do is sometime over the next couple of months convene a follow-up workshop. I'm not exactly sure what format yet, we'll have to work that out, but something that takes this question, saying, all those ingredients we've just heard about, what do we as a community want to do? What serves the collective's best needs? So a workshop to do that. ideally resulting in some kind of position paper that guides us on the next step on this journey, wherever that will take us. So I think we've got the ingredients, we can go away and think about that, but it's critical we keep the momentum in place so that this is a stepping stone on that journey. So with that, I'm going to go into the thank yous. It's like the Oscars bit now, because there's quite a long list. I'm not going to get tearful. So Gabriella, Jose, Ananta, Ella, Kate, Maria, and Will, Anna Casino from CETAF, and Arbins for hosting us, and the technical team at Blue Moon. So if we can just have a collective thank you there. It's like when you see a swan gliding on the surface. There are these legs frantically operating beneath the surface, doing an enormous amount of work, and we're very, very grateful for all of that. Special thanks from the point of view of Biodiversity Genomics Europe for funding from Horizon Europe. We're extremely grateful for that. And also to our external advisory board members who've come here today, to David, to Amber, to Brad, and Florian, who's arrived and over there as well. And finally, thank you to all the attendees and all the speakers and all the participation in the discussions. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you all very much.